We declare ourselves in rebellion against the government and the corrupt, inept institutions that threaten our future. This is a quote from Extinction Rebellion's Declaration of Rebellion, but I feel like it could be a quote from a socialist, perhaps this socialist group. When talking about climate change, it's really important not to assume any prior knowledge. I know we're at an event here about climate change, but that doesn't mean that people have come with an understanding or an interest, yes, but a background, no. So before I start talking about Extinction Rebellion specifically, I want to very briefly introduce the idea of the climate crisis. It's a big topic. It's a very heavy topic. It's not something which makes nice party chit-chat. But I'm gonna give you one sentence which I feel represents this crisis. Right now, we're plunging headlong towards the worst case scenarios. Critical global food and water shortages, rapid sea level rise, social upheaval, mass migration, immense amounts of human, animal, and plant suffering. It's a lot to take in, and it's a lot to talk about. So I want to have a moment just to let those words sink in. Naomi Klein said that climate change is the human rights struggle of our time, and thus it is far too important to be left to the environmentalists alone. And I have to say, she is absolutely right. As I'm sure we're going to discuss today, climate change will first and most severely affect those of lower socioeconomic groups, especially in the countries which have done the least to cause the changes which they're suffering from. It's also true that it is not the individuals who have caused climate change, but it is the corporations. Since 1988, 71% of carbon emissions have been caused by just 100 companies. So when we're told to stop buying plastic bags and using straws and maybe have a 30-second shorter shower, you have to question whether that's really going to have an impact. This event is system change, not climate change, it's system change that we need. These companies, these 100 companies, have knowingly destroyed our planet whilst causing mass suffering and pain to ordinary, innocent people. And why? The answer is simple, and in this room, perhaps quite obvious: for profit. So the question arises, what do we do? As individuals, where does our power lie if it's not in not using straws anymore? When Stevenson, in a book called What We're Fighting For Now Is Each Other, describes a new kind of movement, a convergence of climate justice and grassroots democracy, rooted in local communities and networked nationally and internationally. And that's where Extinction Rebellion comes in. It's a radical, decentralized, visionary movement that is very much present right here, right now. But just 6 months ago, most people, myself included, had never heard of this movement. So where did it come from? Well, in October, we declared to be in a state of rebellion against the government. This was an open declaration. We're not hiding. We're not ashamed. We're proud. After that, everything got started. We blocked 5 bridges in central London on November the 17th. We were swarming roads, blocking them throughout the weeks that followed, digging a grave in the middle of Parliament Square and taking a funeral procession to Buckingham Palace, shutting down BBC headquarters in London, across the country and abroad. Die-ins, lock-ins, school strikes, talks, debates, gatherings of all kinds. Peacefully breaking the law, causing economic disruption, and getting in the way of business as usual, because business as usual will kill us all. We're standing up and saying we're not okay with what's happening, and we will not be complicit in it anymore. And even with all of that, we're only just beginning. Everything that we've done so far has been an act of movement building, and what we're building up to is an international rebellion in April. We will bring the system to a halt. We will say no. We will make it stop, and we won't let things continue until they change in the ways that we demand. And this rebellion, it's about more than just climate change. It's a rebellion for people who want radical change and want it now. Are you interested? Yeah? Hope so. So, a quick idea of what's happening next. In a week today, we're going to be taking a road in Hackney. We'll be blocking the road and having a party in the middle of it. There's going to be a samba band, there's going to be dancing and speeches. It's going to be a lot of fun, and you're all invited, as is everybody you know. Having fun whilst breaking the law and getting in the way of the system is really a great thing to do. Like, the fun that you can have whilst dancing in the street, knowing that there are people down the road who are really angry because they can't get to work. Would recommend it. So this is one example of the sort of thing that we do. The actions themselves vary. Like this roadblock is one thing that we do. The bridges, was anybody here out on the bridges in November? Anyone else heard about it? Yeah, so we took 5 bridges on one day, 6,000 people spread across these 5 bridges. We went out to the roads and we were like, stop. And there were lots of police and they tried to arrest us. They arrested some of us and we said that's okay. Because you, the government, have broken the social contract that exists between us. You broke it first, and so we are no longer tied to our side of things. We feel no obligation to behave in the way that you think we should because you are not upholding your side of the bargain. And we believe that we can't afford to be divided into different movements anymore. When they divide us, they win because they are powerful. And when we come together, we have the power to stand up to them and to match them. We don't have the time to debate the nuances of change. We have to act now. And by we, I mean the environmentalists, the socialists, the leftists, those who are oppressed or have been oppressed in any way, those with children, those with grandchildren, those with anybody that they care about, all people. It's time for us, all of us, to come together, united in a collective desire to prevent our own extinction. And if we can't come together with that, then I don't know what we can come together under. And we know that now is the time that we have to do it. So this is your invitation to join the rebellion. Your poster says one solution, revolution. I feel like revolution and rebellion are pretty synonymous. And if you want to come join the rebellion and call it a revolution, I'm all for that. But whatever it is that you call it, the task is to take the streets, to take action, to say no, we're not going to be a part of this anymore. We're going to stand up. And we're not going to continue with the lives that you want us to continue with, but we're going to be different. See you on the street.
I want to start actually by congratulating Extinction Rebellion, because I think what XR has done is to put the need for mass radical action on the streets back on the political agenda. We've seen the failures of countless international conferences around the question of climate change, and what Extinction Rebellion has done, together with the mass movements, the walkouts by students and school students in Sweden, in Australia, in Brussels last week, 30,000 on the streets, what they've shown is that across the world, millions of people know that the system is broken, that climate change is a real threat, and that actually people want to do something and they are demanding change. And I think that's the most positive thing for the environmental movement that we've seen in many, many years. Jess is absolutely right. We face a worst case scenario. We face an existential threat to humanity, to the society that we know, to the lives that we've led, to the future generations, but also to countless numbers of other species on the planet that face extinction as a result of a warming world, as a result of what the system is doing to the world, and as a result of the knock-on environmental effects. Climate change doesn't just warm the world, it acidifies the oceans, it kills off fish and other marine life. It leads to all sorts of other crises around the globe in terms of how it's organised and its way it is done. And if you were in the United States today, you would have come to this meeting in many parts through incredibly cold weather. The polar vortex that has hit large parts of North America is being used by Donald Trump and the climate deniers to argue that climate change isn't real. How can it be real? We're freezing cold, but actually it's a bit like that. There's an old cartoon, isn't there? The people sat on the Titanic going, "Well, I'm not wet yet. How can there be a problem?" But the reality of climate change is actually exactly the opposite. There's a report in New Scientist this week that people may have seen that actually this year there have only been 2 records broken for temperature for low temperatures for coldness, but 35 already this year have been broken for heat. The general trend is towards a much hotter, a much more dangerous world. Last year, people may remember, the summer of last year was marked by enormous heat waves that impacted upon the lives of millions of people in the North American continent, in Sweden, where there were wildfires, in the north of the Arctic Circle, but particular, as Jess has said, in parts of the developing world, Africa, Asia, China, and so on, which have contributed least to the world. And 20 of the world's warmest years have been in the last 22 years. But in a sense, that warming world masks a much wider problem. The world won't get just hotter and hotter and hotter over a gradual period of tens, decades and centuries. Actually, what you will see is more an exacerbation, an acceleration of extreme weathers, of chaotic weathers, of unusual climatic and weather events, more heat waves, more floods, more droughts, more snowstorms, more polar vortexes as the world changes and gets warmer and more extreme. And because capitalism is an incredibly divided system, with a tiny minority of people who have an enormous amount of wealth, and the vast majority of the population who are very little, the people, as Jess rightly says, who will be hit first and worst by those weather events will be the poorest. Mostly the poorest of the developing world, mostly the poorest in those nations in Africa and South America and Asia and so on, who've contributed least to the problem of global warming and have the least resources to be able to protect themselves and their communities and their societies from the problem. But even in the developed world, the people who freeze, the people who haven't got access to air conditioning when the weather gets hot, are the poorest. The people who can't move, the people who can't leave the cities, the people who can't go on holiday, the people who have no resources. And within that difference, within the difference between the poor and the rich, there are other divisions. Women, black communities are more likely to be impacted by climate change. And I do want to emphasise something, because it's sometimes forgotten, that it is the developing world that has contributed least to this problem. Jess rightly mentioned the report that notes that 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of global emissions. Those corporations almost entirely are based in the developed world, in the west of Europe, in North America and Canada and the United States, and so on. But also, I would argue that this development, the way that capitalism developed historically, was to concentrate wealth in the West and in North America and so on, but also to do that at the expense of the wealth of the developing world, to rob those countries of their natural resources, of their people, of their wealth, to accelerate the process of development in the West, but to leave them poorer and less developed and underdeveloped as a result, and thus least able to both contribute to environmental destruction and also to cope with the problem itself. And the other aspect to this, I mean, I've been an environmental activist now for 30 odd for 30 odd years. And one thing that continues to terrify me is the way that politicians and representatives of organisations and NGOs, non-governmental organisations, will come together with despairing regularity and tell us that something must be done and that something is going to be done. I want to read a quote, really, about what one ecologist, a very well-known one, and a great writer, wrote about this. Global warming. This change is thought to have come about mainly as a result of burning fossil fuels. The output of these and other carbon dioxide sources is clearly outstripping the absorbing capacity of carbon dioxide sinks. If the surplus continues to increase at the present rate, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere promises to reach levels of over 650 parts per million in the next 50 years. Scientists now agree that the present buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere could, if it were to continue without restrictions, spell catastrophe for our planet within less than a century. How can a dangerous bottleneck of atmospheric carbon dioxide be avoided? The obvious answer is by curbing the use of fossil fuels, but it is plainly an answer that today runs straight against the grain of real politics and economic habit. That was written by an author and ecologist called Robert Land, who died in 2005 and wrote that in 1979. Now, when the politicians tell you they didn't know, where the science wasn't clear, we weren't sure what we should do, it was too expensive, nobody told us how bad it was, it's absolute rubbish, it's absolute nonsense. Scientists from the mid to the late 70s were making it absolutely clear that there was a problem. Robert Lamb, of course, if you read further into the book I quoted that from, he makes all sorts of mistakes and misjudgments about the scale of the problem and so on, but nonetheless at the core of his writing in 1979 was a real understanding that what we needed to do was to curb the power of the fossil fuel corporations, to stop burning fossil fuels, to stop those organisations operating, and that they would be a barrier to doing that. And the tragedy is that we're here 40 years later, and actually that sentence could have been written 2 days ago. The tragedy is that actually exactly the opposite has happened, that the system as we lived in has given more wealth, more power to those corporations, more legal space to manoeuvre, and politicians continue to facilitate the fossil fuel organisations to do it. This is why the Tory government has been so friendly and supportive of the fracking industry. You know, they're continuing to allow it to happen, despite us saying for 40 odd years that this really needed to happen. And then when you hear the politicians speaking at the international conferences, they make these promises, but actually, if you really drill down into it, there's very little in there of substance that says how they're going to do it. Back in 2015, some of the people in this room, I recognise some faces, we all went to Paris to protest at the big United Nations talks that were taking place there, COP21. And at the end of it, there was this famous photograph of all the bespeuted men, they're all men, all the politicians standing up and saying, they're all white as well actually, standing up and saying, look, we've solved it, we've got this great plan that's come out of Paris. But actually, if you looked at the detail of Paris, it was all voluntary. Nobody actually had to do anything. Governments made promises that they would do something in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time, but actually there was no legal compulsion to force anyone to do it. And even if they all had done it, if they'd all, out of the goodness of their heart, gone back to their countries and said, look, we're going to do this because there's a real problem, even the figures were still wrong and temperatures would rise by 3.5 degrees ahead. And since then, actually, things have gone backwards, I would argue. Actually, you've had politicians being elected who not just don't agree with it, but actually want to reverse the process. Donald Trump famously is going to pull the United States out of the Paris Accords. People like Bolsonaro in Brazil are open climate deniers who really want to facilitate the further extraction of wealth and so on from fragile ecosystems like the Amazonian rainforest. People should remember that almost the first piece of legislation Bolsonaro passed when he became president, well, the first piece of legislation was to take away rights from LGBT plus people. The second thing he did was to open up the Amazon to the agricultural corporations and the mining corporations that had funded his election campaign. And so when Jess talks about the urgency of what we need to do and a new type of politics, I would say, to deal with it, I think she's absolutely right. And I think part of that is to really understand the problem. And I think I'm really pleased that Extinction Rebellion's starting point is not what we can do as individuals. I think that is so important, that we understand that we have a systemic problem with the society that we live in, not something that cannot be solved by simply drinking out of metal bottles instead of plastic bottles. Capitalism you see, is a system that Karl Marx famously described as being based upon the accumulation for the sake of accumulation, the building of wealth, the growing of wealth simply to make more money in the future, the drive to make profits for the sake of profits. And that leads to all sorts of knock-on effects, if you like, or all sorts of results that are inherently anti-ecological, anti-environment. The first thing is the short-termism. Capitalism and the bosses, they're only interested in the amount of money they make today, tomorrow, next week, next month. They're not interested in the consequences of their actions 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line. The second thing is that capitalism is incredibly wasteful. It uses resources in vast quantities, wastes them and dumps them because it's profitable to do so. You think about the way they build in obsolescence to products so that you constantly have to renew or buy more commodities that have been made out of products and resources. The way that they use fashions to drive us, to compel us to buy the latest version of the iPhone or whatever. But more inherently, capitalism, because it's based on the blocks of competing capital, different corporations in competition with us. There's no rationale to production. There's no plan that says how can we best use the limited resources we have. So you get the madness where there's too many things built, too many things made, too many cars on the production line, too much overproduction that wastes resources and wastes wealth and wastes human labour as well, throws it to the wind. And finally, it's extremely expensive for capitalism because it's based on private profit to actually deal with anything. You know, they have to buy and install equipment and technology to reduce the energy, the impacts of their production process. They don't want to do that because it affects the profits, it affects the shareholders, and so on. So that's one of the problems with capitalism. But actually, I think the problem with capitalism from an environmental point of view, and indeed many other points of view, is that actually it's not just about how production is organised. It's about the systemic nature of capitalism itself, which develops at a particular point in history and develops in a particular way, in a very, very counter-environmental way, if I can make that word up. The first thing that happens is that capitalism, a system, as I said, based on the accumulation of wealth for the sake of accumulation, profits for the sake of profits, has to smash all the old ways of organising society, all the communal land, all the old collective ways of operating and for different societies, whether it's indigenous people in the Americas or whether it's communities in Britain, have to be broken up because they're a barrier to making money and to be making profit. The enclosure of land, the privatisation of land, the commodification of nature and so on. And you see in Britain through the late 17th and 18th and 19th century, a whole series of pieces of legislation passed in Parliament to outlaw the use of the natural world by ordinary people, to privatise land, to privatise animals and so on, so that it can be used by private corporations and private individuals. And Marx puts it like this. Karl Marx writes, "For the first time under capitalism, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility. It ceases to be recognised as a power for itself, and the theoretical discovery of its autonomous laws merely a ruse to subjugate it under human need, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production." I think Marx getting to the centre change, the real transformation that takes place under capitalism, that nature is turned into this commodity and used for profit. And Friedrich Engels, people often argue that Marx and Engels had nothing to say about the environment, nothing to contribute about ecology. Actually, exactly the opposite. Friedrich Engels wrote this beautiful passage in one of his pamphlets, which really it could have been written yesterday by George Monbiot or someone. "As individual capitalists are engaged in production in exchange for the sake of profit, only the most immediate results must be taken into account. As long as the individual manufacturer or merchant sells a manufactured or purchased commodity with a profit, he's satisfied and doesn't concern himself with what happens afterwards to the commodity and its purchasers. The same thing happens to the natural effects of the same actions. What cared the Spanish planters in Cuba who burned down forests on the slopes of the mountains and obtained from the ashes fertiliser for regeneration of very highly profitable coffee trees? What cared they that the heavy tropical rainfall afterwards washed away the unprotected upper stratum of the soil, leaving behind only bare rock? In the relation to nature, the present mode of production is predominantly concerned only about the immediate, the most tangible result, and then surprise is expressed by the more remote effects of the actions directed to this end. Engels there, I think, really summarising the madness, the short-termism of capitalism. But I'd also argue that there's another aspect to this as well, to do with how capitalism develops. At a particular point in history, in England, capitalism adopts fossil fuels, and it's done in the cotton industry in particular, and it's done for a very specific reason. It allows them to move factories away from rivers and watercourses where they've been powered by water energy, and move them to the cities where they can build a factory anywhere. But most importantly, they've got access to lots and lots of workers and so on. There's a wonderful book which perhaps is on sale at the back there by a man called Andreas Malm called Fossil Capital, which really looks into detail about the history of how this happens. But once capitalism in a particular point adopts fossil fuels, all the other competing capitalists have to adopt them as well. And the system becomes a fossil fuel system. And today, dozens and dozens, decades and centuries later, we have a system that's absolutely wedded and obsessed with fossil fuels. To complement Jess's figure around the 100 corporations that are responsible for 71% of emissions, we must remember that I think the majority of those corporations are ones that are to do with the extraction of fossil fuels or the use of fossil fuels, car companies and so on. And just 3 companies, Exxon, BP and Chevron, are responsible for 6% of emissions, 6% of all emissions ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution, not 6% a year. Those 3 companies have contributed to 6% of all emissions. And I would argue that for a sustainable world to develop, it's not enough simply to say we want to tax those companies more, they need less of those. We need to smash those corporations up. We need to end those fossil fuel companies and their hold on the politicians and the corporate around the world. You look at the way vested interests of fossil fuel capitalists often are tied to politicians. So capitalism is developed in a particular way. It's developed along the lines of fossil capital, and it's now in this 21st century fossil capital world. And actually, if we're to do that, we have to challenge the power of those corporations, and they won't want to give it up. There's an oil well that's been jointly built, a facility in the Pacific Ocean that's been jointly built by a number of corporations and state capital from places like Russia and so on. That's worth 180 billion pounds. None of those corporations are going to turn around and go, do you know what? Extinction Rebellion, the SWP, they're right. We're going to give it all up. Sorry, guys, it was a mistake. Actually, they will do everything they can to protect their investment because they want a return on that, which is why we need a political and social movement that can deal with this. And Naomi Klein, in her wonderful book, Capitalism versus the Environment, it makes a real point. Jess mentioned this earlier about what she calls the importance of social movements. In fact, she makes the point that the only hope really lies in social movements. She calls them the politics of blockadia, the sense that the men and women who go out and block the roads, block the fracking apparatus, stop the tar sands being exploited and the pipelines being built, and so on. And she likens those and argues that they need to be on the scale of the great mass movements of history that have changed things in the past. The movements like the anti-apartheid movement that internationally built solidarity with those fighting apartheid in South Africa. The movements like the suffragettes who fought for the right for women to vote, but also the movements that fought for all of us to have the right to vote, and so on. Those mass movements of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of ordinary men and women who fought for real change. And I think she's right in this. We need more environmental movements. We need more people on the streets protesting and demonstrating around these issues. But we also have to recognise that we're not doing that simply to wrest a few reforms from the government. It's not simply enough to say to the government, we want you to ban fracking, but carry on doing all the other stuff. That's all right. It's not enough to say, we want you to ban plastic bags, but actually carry on allowing the fishing industry to dump the used nets in the world and car companies to build what they want. What we have to do is to have mass movements that start to challenge both the priorities of capitalism and how it's organised, which is why I think I want to finish on the need for revolution, really. Because actually I think that we can envisage a new way of organising society, one that is about how ordinary people plan and organise their society in their interests, not in the interests of a tiny minority, not in the interests of shareholders, not in the interests of fossil capitalism, but in the interests of everybody and the planet they live on. And actually, one of the things you see through the process of revolution, if you look, last year was the anniversary, so 2 years ago was the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and we're currently in the 100th anniversary of the German Revolution. If you look at the history, what you always see is that when men and women move collectively into mass action, they start to say, actually, we can do this ourselves. We don't need the governments, we don't need the local governments and all the rest of it. Actually, we can organise our factories, our workplaces, our schools, our colleges in our own interests. And because ordinary people create all the wealth, they're the workers who go to work, who keep the buses running, who keep the oil taps running, who make the renewable turbines and so on. Because they do all the work, they're the ones who've got the power to stop the system. And actually, Marx and Engels didn't just talk about what was wrong with capitalism. They actually had a bit of a vision of how society could be different. They looked to events like the Paris Commune and saw how ordinary workers could start to plan production and start to organise society in their collective interests. And I think today we've had many, many more examples since their lifetimes of how that could be possible. And I think really that's the thing I think that Bill gives us hope. That actually we can build mass movements that can simultaneously challenge capitalism and the fossil fuel nightmare that we live in, but actually also start to build an alternative, can get rid of capitalism and build a new socialist alternative that will relate to the world in a sustainable way. But also, we need socialist organisation to do that. We need socialists in every workplace, in every trade union branch, in every school, in every college, on every course who are arguing that this is wrong, that we can do it differently, that we need to take to the streets. And every time people fight back, whether it's fighting against racism or organising against local fracking in their community, generalising and telling people about that experience, giving people confidence that they aren't powerless, that collectively have enormous power. And I think that's really what socialists are about. And that's really, I think, the hope for the future. If we want a sustainable world, ordinary people are the ones who've got the power to do it. Thank you very much.